Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're stepping back in time to the Siege of Boston, but with a twist. We're not going to focus on the American rebels huddled around the city. Instead, we're going inside the city walls to see things from the British perspective. What were the generals, the soldiers, and the Loyalists thinking as winter closed in on 1775? The answer is a lot more complicated than you might think. Among the Loyalists, the American-born citizens who remained faithful to the king, there was a constant, nagging anxiety. They all looked at the same spot, Dorchester Heights. This high ground overlooking the city was the key to everything. If the rebels fortified it, they could bombard the British fleet and the city itself into submission. One prominent Loyalist, Justice Peter Oliver, wrote that everyone wished the British army would pay proper attention to it. He said it was repeatedly mentioned that securing the position was of the last necessity. But what was the official British response to this obvious strategic threat? Well, it was surprisingly dismissive. The generals would say, "Oh, there's no danger from it." Some even went so far as to say they hoped the rebels would take Dorchester, claiming it would be easy to dislodge them. It was a classic case of overconfidence, a feeling that the ragtag rebel army was no match for the might of the British military. But this bravado masked a deeper, more pressing concern for the British command. The truth is, many of the top British officers didn't want to be in Boston at all. They saw it as a strategic dead end. General Thomas Gage, the commander before he was recalled, had already been writing to London, arguing that New York should be the real seat of war. His successors, including the new commander General Howe, completely agreed. Boston was a trap. It was difficult to defend and impossible to launch any major offensive from. One of the loudest voices calling for a change in strategy was Brigadier General James Grant. Grant was a character, a very large, very opinionated Scottish officer with a famously low opinion of Americans. You might remember him as the one who boasted to Parliament that he could march from one end of the American continent to the other with just 5,000 men. Back in August, months before winter set in, Grant was already insisting that they had to get out of Boston. He wrote a long letter arguing that their situation was just getting worse every day. While the rebels were getting stronger, his solution was drastic. He didn't just want to leave Boston. He wanted to burn it to the ground, he argued. Lenity is out of the question. He also wanted to unleash the Royal Navy to burn every major town along the New England coast. It was a brutal, scorched earth policy that shows you just how frustrated some of the British leadership had become. They saw Boston not as a prize to be held, but as a problem to be eliminated. So, if all the top generals wanted to leave, why were they still there? Well, the answer lies in the incredible slowness of 18th century communication. By the time General Howe finally received orders from London to abandon Boston before winter and move the army to New York, it was already too late. Winter had arrived, the cold had set in, and the harbor was becoming treacherous. But there was another, more human reason for the delay. Howe had a serious logistical problem. He didn't have nearly enough ships to transport his entire army. And it wasn't just the soldiers. There were also hundreds, if not thousands, of Loyalists living in Boston. These were the families who had sided with the Crown, and Howe was deeply concerned about them. He knew perfectly well what would happen to them if they were left behind to face the victorious rebels. They would be seen as traitors, and their fate would be grim. Abandoning them was not an option. Faced with this dilemma, orders to leave, but no practical way to do so, Howe made a decision. He would wait. He would ride out the winter and depart in the spring, at a time and under conditions of his own choosing. He wasn't worried about the American army. He wrote to his superiors in London, assuring them, "We are not under the least apprehension of an attack on this place from the rebels, by surprise or otherwise." At a staff meeting in early December, he doubled down on this confidence. But he did make one thing clear. If, against all expectations, the rebels actually made a move on Dorchester Heights, then the British would have no choice. "We must go at it with our whole force," he declared. An attack on Dorchester was the one thing that would force his hand. But General Howe was not a man in a hurry. Unlike George Washington, who was desperately searching for a way to break the stalemate, Howe was content to wait. He had little inclination to rush things. It was also just an accepted part of 18th century warfare that you didn't campaign in the winter. Armies went into winter quarters, stayed warm, and waited for spring. And so, the British army settled in. They made themselves as comfortable as they could under siege conditions. For the officers, This meant a social season of parties, plays, and dinners. Life inside the city, at least for the elite, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy and even festivity. There was one notable exception to this patient, wait-it-out attitude: Major General John Burgoyne. Known as Gentleman Johnny, Burgoyne was a dashing figure, a successful playwright, and a decorated officer who had brought a lot of energy to the social scene in Boston. But he was also ambitious and deeply impatient with what he called the Army's supineness, or lazy inaction. He wanted a command of his own and a chance for glory. Seeing none of that on the horizon in Boston, he packed his bags and sailed back to England in early December, missing the dramatic events that were to come. So as 1775 came to a close, you had this incredible contrast. Outside the city, the Continental Army was struggling to survive, short on supplies and gunpowder, with their commander desperate for action. Inside the city, the British Army, the most powerful military force on earth, was comfortably waiting for spring, secure in their belief that the rebels posed no real threat. They ignored the warnings about Dorchester Heights, content in their professional arrogance. They had no idea that the rebels were about to pull off one of the most audacious and decisive operations of the entire war. Thanks for watching, everyone. It's fascinating to see how overconfidence and logistical problems can shape the course of history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the past. Let me know in the comments what you think the British should have done differently. See you in the next video.